I'm Laura Weens. I took on too much for this and project, but we're gonna just do what we can. And I wanted to show you my dolls before we get started because I use these as I work with clients. Okay. And so I think I'll go into the individual in the presentation, but I want you to know they're actual physical dolls and not just arbitrary that I've picked in these goofy pictures. Okay. So this is our attached doll, you know, please love me, please pick me up, please take care of me. This is our flight doll. I don't want to, I got to get out of here. I can't do this. Right. This is our freeze doll. Oh my God, 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 right? Poor thing. This is our fight doll, whether fighting the self or fighting others, right? And this is our submit or fawn one. All right. They are neuro peeps, Neuro peeps. You can buy them online. I use them all the time. You can get any ethnicity for them. So depending on who you work with. So I know they're a little goofy, but what I am doing in this presentation is showing some of the patterns and internal relationships that often go with BPD between these different parts. And so that's why I'm using them as examples. But I actually really like using these dolls since I got them. I find they're very helpful just as a simple tool. Because as you all know, probably people tend to very much dislike any, if not all of them, these parts of themselves, and so having childlike portrayals that you can actually hold yourself can take some of that, can really help with the sort of internal self-criticism, right? That's common. So just when you're seeing the pictures of the dolls, I'm just spelling out the patterns, but there's ways you can integrate this into your work, but you certainly don't have to. Like, the concepts transcend that. So I thought this was a lovely graphic for this idea that we're born into our world completely dependent on others for our physical and our emotional survival. And how attuned adults are to us, our caregivers, impacts our ability to form healthy and secure attachments to people throughout the lifespan. Attunement is what I want to talk about. We are dependent on others to attunement, I think, is several steps, to notice that we're distressed and to respond. A child whose cries are ignored learns that their needs and distress do not truly matter and are not even real, that it's not safe to be a person with needs and feelings. So infants and young kids really depend on adults to notice and respond to their physical needs. So when an adult notices a child's emotional distress over an unmet need and responds in a way that soothes the distress, meets the need, in this case, we have a hungry kid, that's attunement, which encourages secure attachment. Routinely, we misinterpret the needs of infants and small children. And when this happens, the child will reject our efforts. But if we get emotionally dysregulated in response to the rejection, that's when we have misattunement, right? So instead of saying, okay, well, the kid doesn't like this, the kid's not hungry, let's try something else. If we get dysregulated and insist on doing it a certain way and keep pushing or get angry at the kid or yell at the kid for not, having their needs met the way we think they should, that's misattunement. And if that happens repeatedly or all the time, the child cannot, well, it happens repeatedly, they can't form a secure attachment. So in addition to our needs for physical things, infants and young children naturally turn to adults for comfort and protection. And when an adult notices that the child is distressed and responds in a way that soothes the distress, this is attunement, fostering secure attachment. Again, sometimes a child will rebuff an adult's attempt to comfort or protect them. And once again, if repeatedly the adult becomes emotionally dysregulated in response, this will lead to misattunement, where both the parent and the child are dysregulated, and the dysregulation of one increases the dysregulation of the other, and so forth. However, if the adult stays regulated and adjusts their behavior to meet the child's needs more effectively, that's attunement. So with borderline personality disorder, and frankly, with anybody with most people with complex PTSD, developmental trauma, there's an element of disorganized attachment. And so when the primary caregiver of a child ages 0 to 3 is chronically misattuned, whether intentional or not, usually unintentional, the child has an impossible dilemma. They cannot form an attachment to their caregiver. And I borrowed this slide from Janina Fisher because she keeps it really simple. So developmental, attachment trauma causes disorganized attachment. Is it safe to be attached? When early attachments are safe, we feel comfortable in relationships. But what happens in the middle triangle? What happens when a parent figure creates safety instead of danger? Well, versus danger. On the bottom, when early attachments are dangerous, there's an internal struggle between the yearning to attach and the drive to be safe. Do I run toward or do I run away? Ideally, again, at the top, it's safe to be close and it's safe to be by myself. But with disorganized attachment, nothing is safe, right? The impulse to fight or flee comes from it isn't safe to be connected or to depend. Watch out, don't trust anybody. But there's also the impulses to attach, to be close, to trust. And those parts, and then so I want to be close. I don't want to be alone. So what this looks like in adults can look very different depending on a range of factors, including the temperament of the children, the behaviors of the caregiver, and other things in the environment. However, it's a primary contributing variable to many personality disorders and in the lives of adults with complex PTSD, and certainly with DID, including people with DID that don't have a personality disorder. So compared to others with disorganized attachment, people with BPD or, that have parts that cycle in this way, tend to have stronger physiological responses to people and events compared to other people, including other trauma survivors. I mean, not everyone who develops attachment trauma has a temperament that is highly sensitive and causes more, strong reactions. People with BPD, unlike some other people with disorganized attachment, has at least parts that actively want support and are consciously afraid of abandonment and rejection. And I say this because people who are primarily avoidant or narcissistic or have in their presentation or in what's their comfort zone is, they still have attachment needs, but they're not verbalized. They don't lead the show. Whereas with people with BPD, there are at least times in which they're very conscious of, I don't want to be alone. I want comfort, I want support. And that's actually in longer terms a strength in terms of being able to get help, because they're likely to show up in our offices, right? And they're likely to turn to other people. And sometimes they get lucky and those people are decent people and things get better. But it's just a difference. And also people with BPD may fluctuate very widely in their ability to function in the sense of like going to work or school or whatever, based on whether they're consistent, supportive people. This can be from 1 hour to the next, one season of life to the next, or if there's a relational disruption. And some people, I will say, with BPD have the ability to form attachments. It's not entirely disorganized attachment. It just goes to this place really quickly when there's misattunement. So one way to view disorganized attachment is a constant internal battle between these parts. Because you have a situation where nothing's worked. If one of these parts had gotten a consistently good result, they would probably be the ones doing most things, but there's no win, because we have that a dilemma between do I have the suffering and disorientation of being alone, or do I, go to people who have been abusive and hurtful and misattuned. There's not a good solution. And just a FYI, for the remainder of this presentation, I'm going to refer to these parts as singular for simplicity. So the attached part as opposed to parts, flight part as opposed to parts. However, if a person has DID or OSDD along with borderline personality disorder, there easily can be multiple attached parts, multiple flight parts, multiple freeze parts. So I'm using singular, but it's not always singular. So someone with BPD, the reason that they're terrified of abandonment is that rejection or even anticipated rejection and abandonment, those experiences in the present trigger emotional flashbacks of early attachment trauma. And once they're triggered, you're back in the state that a young child is, with feelings of helplessness, terror, or even rage that you felt as an infant and young child when you're completely dependent on a caregiver that was absent or misattuned. So it's not that, and that's why it's not safe to be alone, because alone isn't just like, oh, I happen to be alone. Alone is like, I am alone and helpless in the universe. I have no ability to manage my emotions. I have no ability to prove anything for myself. It's pre-verbal trauma. So often people don't even have words for it, or the words don't really fit it. Like it's the person is experiencing horrific emotional flashbacks when they feel alone. And so when they say they don't want to be alone, I mean, if you're someone who hasn't experienced this, it seems like, well, and being alone can easily be, those experiences aren't necessarily experiences where the other person is absent. It's experiences when the other person is misattuned, right? So being afraid of being alone, yeah, it could be actual somebody leaves you, but it could also be that they just, they're angry with you as you're crying or distressed, or they're there, but they're absent, they're checked out, or, they're actually actively hurting you, right? So, that fear of being alone, but the alone feeling is there's part of me inside that desperately needs somebody to come and rescue and protect, and nobody's there. And the people that are supposed to do it aren't doing it, and they're causing the problem. So I think that's important to understand and can give us compassion when, to understand the lengths of which people with BPD will do to avoid feeling those things. Okay, so another caveat before I dive into some of the particulars. These slides are examples sometimes of how these internal parts work together with BPD, but every client is different. And part of the work in terms of helping people is to identify, well, what are the parts and which part accompanies which part responds to which part. That's the work. So the stuff I'm going through, I give several possibilities, but in clinical work, it's figuring out what is happening for the person in front of you and being attuned to that person, and figuring out how to help them be attuned to themselves and what's happening to them, because they don't know. They just know that they have big feelings that they're terribly ashamed of, and that everybody gets fed up with them. That's what they know. Or that everybody's just a piece of shit. They don't understand what's happening. So anyways, these are specific examples, but what is universal is that attached part, or the attached parts, are always, always, always accompanied by other parts. They are never allowed to be on their own. Even if you think they're on their own, there are other parts like right there, because to be attached is not to be safe. And so parts that want to attach, that want to have somebody to care for them, and your client may and say, I just want someone to love me, I just want someone to care, I just want someone to whatever. They are never alone, never, ever, ever. And so part of helping somebody with BPD understand what is happening is to figure out which parts are actually involved, because each part needs different things, and a mindful, compassionate part to all of the parts is what settles the stuff down. So here we go. So the attached part, when a person with BPD is alone and feels lonely, scared, overwhelmed, or helpless, the attached part likely fantasizes about somebody, some perfect somebody who's going to finally care, who's going to finally protect them, who's going to finally comfort them. And one thing maddening to clients with BPD is that it could be that all the other parts think that this is BS, that there is nobody coming. And so why do they keep getting in these situations in which, they let themselves be attached to these terrible people? Well, the reason is that to be attached is to be alive. And the only way to really kill off to kill off that desire to attach, is, to be, completely numbed out by dissociation or drugs or something. Otherwise, it's there. And when you don't have good people to attach to, what you have instead is fantasies. And fantasies is, they're made up of TV, they're made up of, romance novels, they're made up of, like if you haven't had something, you have a fantasy, right? I mean, it's just like if you don't have money and no one in your life knows how to actually make money and secure money, it's fantasy. It's, gee, it'd be nice to be rich and live in a mansion and buy this kind of car, right? Like it's fantasy because you don't know the steps to actually doing it. So here's the thing. So as soon as the attached part considers seeking comfort or protection externally, the fight part is activated immediately. So the fight part is the part that's like people holds on to the knowledge of all the terrible things people have done and the knowledge that people are not safe. So they try to prevent that attachment vulnerability by being suspicious of other people, trying to control people on the outside, but also trying to control the other parts. So the fight parts maintain whatever messages the person learned early in life about why their caregiver was misattuned. For people with BPD, because unlike some other people, they generally can't stop themselves. Like they find it harder than other parts to completely shut down through dissociation or self-harm. The intensity occasionally of rage or fear or whatever. And because of this, the internal messaging tends to be around preventing the person from having intense negative emotions. Because usually the messaging they've received is that they're either weak or crazy or demanding, they're attention seeking, they're manipulative, they're controlling, they're emotional. And so that messaging, the fight part will actively be repeating it to all the other parts all the time to try to keep the attached part from going out, from running amok and then triggering the attachment trauma, which then dysregulates the entire person. So when the attached part wants to reach out for someone externally or for comfort or protection, the fight part will remind them that, they're going to be abandoned because you are, et cetera, weak, crazy, et cetera. Some therapists refer to this part as the inner critic. Okay, so if these parts were fully in control, interactions with other people would only occur when the attached part is not remotely distressed and when the interactions were under a certain sort of control. And sometimes with BPD, sometimes this happens, but the thing is, because it's a constant boiling pot, nothing stays that way for long, okay? So during moments when the fight part is dominant, someone with BPD may feel strong, independent, empowered. During these times, they are aware of ways people have hurt them and are like, I don't need that in my life. I'm fine. I'm just going to, go about it, no problem. I'm good on my own. So when a person is torn between basically the attached part wants to attach, but the fight part is like, that is a terrible idea. They may go into freeze. Freeze is what all mammals experience when there's no way forward to safety. On the outside, this looks like panic attacks and may even be accompanied by the inability to speak or even mood, depending. So yeah, but a freeze state is a state where, where the desire to attach and the desire to run, like, it's like, if you think about a rabbit's trying to figure out, can I run away fast enough? And so they're looking at the goal of, okay, I could run to there, but they don't know if they can get there fast enough. And they're like, well, I might be safe if I stay still. Well, I might be safe if I run. And there's that not knowing. And similarly, freeze state in humans are, okay, attachment is, no, I need them, but they'll hurt me, but I need them, but you're pathetic, and this can trigger a freeze state. So when an attached part experiences emotional flashbacks of abandonment or is overcome with shame, because of the fight part's messages, that's where the flight part comes in. And the flight part will suggest any number of distractions to not think about this stuff. And, to some degree, a lot of the coping skills we learn with CBT, DBT are distraction-based coping skills. And frankly, most people with BPD need them because the ones that the flight part will suggest first are things that, generate a strong emotional response that then shifts the person out of whatever state was so uncomfortable. And that's any and all addictions, self-injury, suicidal thoughts, fantasies, actions, binge eating, losing yourself in work, whatever it takes, right? So flight parts, that's their solution to the impossible dilemma between attach and not attach. But then you get into the attachment addiction cycle. This could be a whole presentation too. So after the addictive behavior is chosen, fight part is like, look at you, you're pathetic. You did this thing again. You did this to yourself. You did that to yourself. Although sometimes fight parts are part of that cycle too, telling the flight part, but anyways, like I said, this is one configuration. This is not the only configuration. Okay. So after the person has chosen the addictive behavior, the attached part may want help, may like, I got to go to therapy. I want rehab. I want to tell somebody, or may go to your partner, please help me. I'm cutting. Please help me not cut. However, rejection and abandonment is expected. And so then as soon as those feelings of either anticipated rejection or actual rejection or fight part says, no, there's no help for you, this causes more distress, which then causes more addictive behaviors, right? So that stress addiction bit is also very, very, and that's why on the DSM, it talks about suicidal behaviors, self-injury, addiction. I mean, that's that. So when the attachment part is not paralyzed by freeze, and the fight and the flight parts, can't avoid the attached part from wanting people, the attached part never goes out alone, ever, ever, ever. There's going to be a fight part and sometimes a fawn or submit part. So fawn or submit parts, their job is to make other people feel unthreatened. And this has two purposes. One is just simply avoiding abuse of other people, so if what prevents that abuse is to be invisible, the fawn part will be invisible. If it's, sucking up to people and doing this, the submit part will do that. If it's, making people laugh so they don't think about, so they're not mad, the submit part will do that. So fawning, there's a lot out there about fawning, but fawning is basically shape shifting to become who the other person needs you to be. And the purpose is either simply to prevent them from hurting you, but also fawn submit parts helps the attached part meet their attachment needs somewhat. And attached parts and fawn parts go together. And attached parts sometimes, very often believe that if the fawn part is successful, maybe then I'll be loved. Maybe then I'll think I'm special. Maybe then they'll help me. So those tend to work together. So I said this already, when interacting with external people, these parts do things such as caretaking, self-criticism, praising the other person, or in any other way anticipating the other person's needs. Okay, fawn submit parts are never ever alone either. They always have fight parts, because the fight parts are the ones that are like, okay, well, you want things to go badly? Well, people hate you because you're a needy loser. So don't be needy. Don't do this. Oh, wait, you're doing it wrong. Don't be needy. Don't do this thing. Like, they're the constant dialogue. And often for BPD, the part of them that they think like, this is me, this is myself, is actually a fawn part, right? And, the complaint is often, I just hate myself, whatever. And that's part of that dynamic of what's happening. Okay. So when the submit fawn parts are dominant and, fight part's always whispering in the submit part's ear, the attached part is often in the background hoping like, oh, I'm doing it right. Are they going to love me? However, the submit part, the part that's focused on being whoever the other person needs them to be, is often not even aware of the attached part because they're focused on what the other person needs, right? And so what can happen is the submit part goes out there and is like, I'm going to take care of you. I'm going to do this. I'm going to do that. And is very focused on the other person. But in the background, the attachment part is like, do they love me? Do they like me? Are they going to take care of me? And so when nothing happens, like they don't get their needs met, then the attached part afterwards is unhappy. And then that can trigger the dysregulation cycle as well. There are also scenarios in which the fight part is dominant, but the attached part is in the background, motivating the fight part to some degree. So in these scenarios, the fight part asks for help on behalf of the attached part, but in a way that's very controlling. For example, if the helper, the external person is a partner, the attached part is allowed to ask the partner to cook, but only if the person does it exactly right. So the fight part will say, can you take out the garbage? And whether or not it's spoken or not spoken, it means right now, right? Or can you cook, but make sure you cut it up this way and you do it in this order. So then if the other person fails to do the specifications, the fight part will tell the attached part, well, this is why you're not supposed to do this. And the attached part gets dysregulated because part of what the fight part is doing also is carrying out the fantasy. So again, attached parts, if they haven't had secure attachment, like they don't know what that is, right? They look around and see like, okay, other people that are loved, what are they getting? All right, well, those people have people that help them with this, right? So then this creates the narrative of, well, if you loved me, you would do the thing exactly as I specified. And so then that creates misattunement. And so then that goes awry, you go back into the attachment trauma and the cycling. Okay. So that isn't one thing that can happen. Another thing that can happen is temporarily the attached part is so distressed, they are the most powerful part for the moment. And then in this case, all four other parts are right there saying, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. Okay. And if somehow, heaven forbid, the external person, whether it's the therapist or the partner or whatever, helps that attachment part feel good and it actually works, this also creates internal havoc. So immediately, as soon as the attached part starts to feel good, that fight part is like, all right, well, they helped you now, but they're going to get fed up with you. Or they did it, but only because you made them. Or yeah, they're here now, but they're not, what about this? So they didn't do this part of what you wanted. They didn't do this part of your fantasy. Like the fight part will do everything to keep the attachment part from being happy with how the things went, because then that is dangerous and they will put themselves in danger again. Okay. And if the attached part goes out and the helper does not succeed, I said this, but this is not quite right either. The attached part is sad and lonely, but not just sad and lonely, but then the flashbacks start, right? But on some level, even then, the fight part is relieved because at least we're getting away from those people, and people are bad and people will hurt us. So there's always, again, if there's one reaction, there's an opposite reaction inside somewhere. And sometimes, some with BPD is just cycling very quickly between these different parts. And sometimes the other two too. Sometimes there's moments of freeze mixed in with all this and the person is panicking. And let's see, what's the other one? And yeah, in some parts, and sometimes they're in the middle of an addiction. So all this is happening while the person is like wanting to cut themselves. So when things go amok and everything is out of control, and you are present with that person, you're going to get told double messages like crazy. The one submit part is going to be talking about how they're a piece of shit. The fight part is going to be telling you, the person is trying to help them, what you're doing wrong. The attached part is like, help me, I'm about to cut myself, help me, help me, help me. And, and if they can tell, and what happens is, as an external person, you're responding, the attached part doesn't understand, why don't you just love me and help me? But you're responding to like, oh my God, this person's about to cut themselves. Oh, they're blaming me, they're mad at me. Oh my gosh, I'm helpless here. They keep freaking out. And I didn't know this was going to happen because the submit parts did such a good job of convincing me that this wasn't about them at all. It was about me. And all of a sudden this person is cycling in front of me. My God, what do I do? So, right. So all of this, as soon as this happens, the person the partner, the therapist, the person in the hospital program, whatever, is like, oh my God, I feel out of control. This is terrifying. This is awful. And that's when the person ends up in the hospital or something else. I think I'm going to briefly stop the share and see if anyone has comments about that overwhelming amount of information I just threw out there.
I couldn't find the hand raise gesture on my computer, but may I ask a quick question about the BPD attachment cycle? I'm sorry, let me just look for my question really fast. I wrote it down. Okay, so the attachment cycle, the trauma trigger, you said the flashback occurs in the infant stage. And
Mhm.
I'm wondering, can it also be young childhood stage?
Yes,
Okay,
yes. Any significant early abandonments or misattunements, yes. And since the person doesn't, that's a lot of that's pre-verbal. And so like the person with this generally doesn't even fully understand why they all of a sudden feel terrible, right? They're left with two explanations. One is I'm screwed up. And the other one is, well, obviously the thing the other person did right before I felt this way was an evil, terrible thing. And so this is an abuser. Whether or not that person is an abuser, sometimes they are. Sometimes this person has managed to hook up with an abuser. But whether or not you as an external person are an abuser, you will be perceived as an abuser at some point. Because that person's only option is, I am the most worthless human who has ever existed and must punish myself, or you are the most evil person ever because you're making me feel this pain. And they don't realize they're having a flashback because it's pre-verbal and it creates the context of their entire life. So they just think what's happening is that people are just torturing them or don't care or are indifferent, right? Because if you freeze in response to this, then you're indifferent and you don't care, right? If you try to offer comfort, heaven forbid you succeed, then the fight part is more suspicious of you than before you succeeded. If you fight back, the attachment part is like, see, you're abusive to me. You're saying mean things. You don't love me. If you're submissive and just try to tiptoe around them, then you're not strong enough to help them. And then you're abandoning them in a different way, right? So basically, they're in a threat state that then generates threat in us, and everything is wrong. And I think early in my career, I had the fantasy that if I could help that attached part, things would be good. Like if I could just show them that, like, oh, you are cared about, and I see you're suffering, and yada, 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 then they would be good. But one of my first clients who ended up stalking me, that's what made her so bad. Like the more I helped her feel good in a session, the worse nasty emails I would get. And at the time I was suckered into trying to respond to all them. And then when I succeeded in responding to all them and made the attachment part feel even better, then I was the most dangerous person on earth. Then I was like the most terrible person. And so the responses these clients tend to get is either people like me who are like trying to love them and, have their own issues around like, I'm not good enough or I'm not being loving enough or whatever, and which are reinforced by these clients. Or, if your response to your own, traumas is just to disconnect and shut down, then and to disconnect from yourself, you're just like, these clients are crazy, they're manipulative, they're attention seeking. Oh my God, like this is way too much for me. Send them to the hospital, right? Like, so they will generate whatever issues you have around attachment and whatever generations you have around a relationship. You will feel it with these clients. You will. And you may only feel it 2 years in when they feel comfortable enough with you for this stuff to come out. And you're thinking, oh, this client is very happy with me. I feel very successful with my therapy, blah, 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 blah. But when they feel safe enough to let you see what the actual problem is, and the actual problem is constant attachment flashbacks, and cycling inside. If they're really good at fawning, you won't know, right? Or or if they're really good at dissociating, you might get more of a numb presentation most of the time and just the facts, right? So like this stuff can come out of nowhere, and really and in a way, and in that way it shouldn't be a diagnosis. It should be more thought of a response to attachment trauma that people at times feel in the scope of their recovery. Really makes sense, because this is what attachment trauma does. And when I've had clients that were more avoidant and we got past the avoidance, this is what happened to them too. Not necessarily the constant, I love you, I hate you stuff. But I desperately want to attach and that feels very unsafe. And so I need to run, certainly.
So a lot of what you described is, the fluidity of ego states as we all experience, but with those who are in extreme ego states. And part of the work is just helping those parts in those states. What do
Mhm.
you use as kind of a guiding end goal that you hope for your clients? And I know that's hard to answer because it's so unique to the circumstances, but what are some of the guideposts that you use and hope for ultimately in treatment? Actually, the ultimate goals, end goals that you hope for in treatment. What are you shooting for if you have any agenda at all? Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, I mean, I would say self-compassion for all the parts, ability to have some compassion for yourself and compassion for other people. And, I found that this kind of work over time, even people that weren't actually very compassionate at all at the beginning of treatment, when you do this work, eventually they soften too.
Hmm. So self-compassion, assuming that that in itself is healing enough, and uh, that's it.
Well, and self-compassion and yeah, exactly, an attachment relationship among the parts, right?
Okay.
And
Yeah.
and then and figuring out what each part needs because they're all very different. Like fight parts do not want lovey fuzzy whatever. They want respect. They want validation. That's a terrible idea to trust, and that sometimes people suck. You know, um, submit parts just want to know they're doing a good job, and that the problem is that not like acceptance. That the problem is nobody can be perfect. Yada yada. Right. The attached parts want the love. The the run parts need to know that if need be, they can run. They need to have control. Flight parts, you know? And so when you're working with somebody, like what I do is as I get to know a client, it'd be like, okay, this I can tell part of you is feeling good. Is there a part telling you this is all bullshit? And I'll say, good for them. They're trying to protect you from getting hurt. That's awesome. You know, oh, is there a part, are you really wanting to cut right now after this session or, whatever it is they do to whatever their addiction is, there's always something. Um, you know, say, yeah, no, I can see why you'd want to shut this down. These are big feelings, that makes sense to shut them down. So you're regulating and you're modeling, being mindful to the needs of each of the parts.
Mm.
And what we do instead is we get sucked into rescue or we prioritize one part over the other.
Mm.
We're therapists, we want to do lovey-dovey, right? Or we're shut down ourselves, and so we just reinforce the messages that they're too crazy, too dramatic, too emotional, whatever, right? So, but really, there's separate needs. Janina Fisher does an awesome job at spelling out the needs of the different threat parts in her book, which her most recent book, which I have at the end.
Oh, good. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about, and maybe this is a deferral to the Janina Fisher book, but submit
Okay.
and you said it's kind of a negative self-view typically.
Mhm.
Are there alternatives you can think of to that, how it might present?
It's also, actually, well, an interesting little tidbit. With DID, to some extent, all the parts that present in the world are submit parts because you have to create, or day-to-day parts, because you have to create what is going to incur the least abuse. And so what you're constantly doing is figuring out, okay, in this friend group, or okay, I have to do this mom thing. What do I need to create myself to be? In this friend group, what do I have to create myself to be? When dealing with men, what do I have to create myself to be? And you're doing it because having actual needs, opinions, thoughts, and wishes are the dangerous thing. And so really the whole self in different ways or selves get focused on social survival rather than on developing as a person and having who you are and whatever be an accurate reflection of what you need and what you actually want and what you actually think. So those parts become everything. Although they can merge external presentation with fight parts, and people who let fight parts win most of the time, those are our narcissists, you guys. That they're getting attached needs met by trying to control the other environment and keep that humiliation away. by trying to get other people to behave a certain way for them. So fight parts are trying to control other people when they're out in the external world and forward. Fawn parts are trying to indirectly control people by controlling themselves. I mean, both are about trying to control people. One is actively trying to control them, getting people to do this, that, or the other. And one is controlling one's own presentation, emotions, everything about oneself, so that there's the least risk of triggering that developmental trauma, that attachment trauma, and so forth. And so when you're working with them, the actual treatment goes along with self-compassion. It's just to help somebody become a person, you know, like, okay, these are something I feel versus I'm supposed to feel, you know, versus the only feeling is I'm afraid that people are going to respond badly because I'm not good enough and I'm not who I'm supposed to be, or, you know, I'm trying to tiptoe around so I don't get triggered. I mean, those are feelings, but they're not primary wants, goals, and wishes, right? They're not. And so what you're trying to ultimately give somebody permission to be a person.
I'm wondering if I could share in person just the presentation part, not this with anybody's pictures, with some of my clients.
Sure.
Oh, thank
Yeah.
you so much. Yeah.
Yeah, and I really recommend, I mean, they're silly, these little dolls, but they're not, because the thing is, like, you know, and like I have clients that are like, I'm like, okay, so who is it? This one. This one, they all hate this one. This one causes all the problems, right? This is the one, like, if I could just stop needing the effing people, I'd stop being pathetic. I'd stop, you know, getting into being dysregulated. Like, people ask me, well, can't we just cut them off? I'm like, and people also hate, and the real submissive people hate this one, you know, because this one is the one, you know, who dares to be angry at other people and is putting them in danger by messing with their ability to be the perfect thing they want to be to other people. And they also hate this one because this is the one that tells them they're effing up all the time. You didn't do this right. You didn't do this right. You got to do this. You got to do this. So hatred for this one is also very strong. But they also hate this one. Why can't I stop binging eating? Why can't I stop cutting myself? What's wrong with me that I think about suicide all the time? You know, so they hate that one too. Wow. And they hate this one because nobody likes to panic, and because this one is the one that didn't fight back when they were being abused, right? This is the one that there's part of them in the background wanting to be assertive, wanting to do this one, and this one's like, nope, not safe, not safe. So they also hate that one. People hate that one. Oh, and yeah, people just hate this one because it's like, you know, you're pathetic. You know, you're nothing. You're just being who other people want you to be. You're not. So the part of how somebody presents is which one they hate to what degree. Because there's almost always one that is like, none of them are pleasant, but like acceptable. And sometimes, ironically, they'll think they don't dislike this one to some degree, or they'll think, I just want people to, at least in some ways, I just want people to love me. I don't understand why everyone hates me. I don't understand why everyone rejects me. Like, and if they present that way first, the feelings that pulls is like, oh, well, you're a lovely person, you blah, blah, blah. You know, you want to assure that, you know, attached part, hey, you know, I like you. I'm not rejecting you. Everything is good. But you're just getting into bee's nest that way because the other parts are waiting for you. And so part of the discipline of it is especially when somebody seems to, whatever they present, there's part of them that feels the opposite. And especially when they start to feel good, you know? And so I always ask people, well, what's it like to have a good feeling about this, or to be successful about this, or to feel connected? Is there any part of you that does not like this? You know, is there any chance you're more inclined to cut yourself after feeling like this? Right? Because we understand addictions to get rid of bad feelings, but I think what we're not educated on is that good feelings are also, especially attachment feelings, are very dangerous as well to them. And so, and sometimes depending on success can be dangerous, you know, whatever way they're actually becoming a person and expressing genuine thoughts, feelings, whatever, and to whatever extent they're getting attachment needs met, those are the most dangerous things of all. And so the things you think are great, wow, you met with a friend, you went for a bike ride. Like, there are parts that are like, oh no, he started to feel too good about himself. He's going to put us in a situation that's going to really screw up, and then he's going to screw up and be a failure, and everyone's going to hate him. So we can't do that. no more bike rides. So every step forward, especially out of ordinary step forwards, like if the person is like, if their primary part is basically a fawning part that's like an overachiever and always achieving, yeah, that's not what's going to generate the pushback. But the pushback will be, if they actually do some self-care, right? Or if they actually, are assertive or something. But the things we think are growth, there will be part of these clients that hate those things, even if they don't know it, even if what they're telling you is, I want to grow, I don't want to cut myself, I want this, I want that. And that's why it doesn't work. And that's why you can have these great sessions and then they either forget them, or you find out they cut afterwards, or, then they're much worse. And you're like, well, what the hell, finally getting into it. And, finally seem to feel safe with me. And we talked about the core stuff. Like, what's the problem? Well, that's the problem.
Would you suggest that clients get a set of these dolls so they can work with them?
Yeah, they're great. I mean, you get all 5 of them for $99. I mean, not possible for all people, but most people.
Mhm. Okay. Thanks, Laura.
Yeah. And some, of course, have responded to their trauma by disliking any childishness in others or themselves. Those ones will resist the dolls. But, even them sometimes over time. It's the one way to disconnect from your child pain is, to hate children, to hate things that remind you of children. Some people have that too. In which case their fight part is usually more dominant. I'm an adult, I'm in control, I'm this, I'm not a baby, I'm not, a needy, pathetic, whatever.
So I actually recently just had my first client in private practice who has a more traditionally borderline presentation and came in with that diagnosis from a past therapist. I have quite a few people who have a dissociative disorder, and my impression right away was that the parts were there in a way that I understood, but that they were kind of rapid fire coming at me. So your description of that was really helpful and validating. And I noticed right away too that her attached part was more prominent, even though the other parts were there. And then I had the urge to validate that part and bond with her and rescue her. So I've already gotten a lot of good feedback about that from you, from what you shared. I guess my question might be, what do you think are some of the most important interventions in the early days with someone like this? My gut says, and from what you shared, that it's about self-regulation and trying to attune to each part. But I would love to hear you speak on that, on like what's important early on.
Yeah. Okay. So early on, honestly, it's a lot of just validation, because part of attunement is just trying to track where they are. And so saying, okay, it seems like in this moment you're feeling this, or I can see you're feeling this, but you're also feeling this. And just introduction to the parts idea, and just being able to track them and help putting words on what's happening in the session. And then the other thing would be just, well, actually, I should just share some of the stuff I have on the presentation, really. Okay. Yeah. So step 1 is educating the client about attachment trauma and parts. And so, that's when I'll just, and that's when, I'll introduce the dolls, I'll introduce the parts, depending on what they're ready for. And, if they come in and say, like, I have BPD, I'll explain that, well, BPD is about attachment trauma, and, they need to hear they're not crazy, and that this intensity they're feeling, is because they're being triggered into stuff. And that when they were little and had strong responses, they weren't helped to get from a place of an intense response to a calmer response. That is emotional regulation, and that's something you have to internalize because someone else helps you do. And so if you don't, then even as an adult, you have an intense response and you don't know how to get from A to B. And so just like education about attachment, I guess a lot of psychoeducation about attachment, trauma, about emotional regulation, but in the spirit of like, you're not crazy, like there's a logic to this, this is about you trying to make sense of a situation that wasn't, sensible. And also at that stage, because some people with BPD don't have parents that were abusive in the traditional sense. Like some of them absolutely do, but some say, well, my mom, she didn't hit me or nobody molested me. It's like, well, but explaining that attachment trauma is trauma. And I will also explain to people, which is very true, that people who are sexually abused that don't have attachment trauma don't even necessarily have and if they have attunement and they are rescued and helped and gotten out of the situation, like the long-term effects are like teeny tiny. Whereas someone with attachment trauma, even without sexual or physical trauma, like it affects everything. It affects them every day, all their relationships. It affects how they see themselves. It affects everything. So disorganized attachment is, matters. And you can have disorganized attachment to a parent that was, maybe they were abused growing up and did everything they could to not hurt you and absolutely did not do the things their parents did to them. So separating out attunement from abuse can be helpful for some clients. So that's another educational thing. So let's do the next slide. Yeah, and then specifically, and the Janina Fisher book is better than that, over about this, but how to, address each part individually and what their needs are. And this is more of an advanced thing, but I did want to say something about this because I think this is important. Part of the heartbreak of BPD is you long so much for connection, and yet it keeps, even if the person is steady with you, you keep experiencing, abandonment, all these terrible, and this attachment trauma. And it does still affect your relationships. So I actually, this is where I think I'd like to do this presentation more places, because there are many interventions designed to teach interpersonal skills to people with BPD, including DBT, has some awesome ones. This is important, but it is a Band-Aid. And it will not work consistently, even if the person, I know DBT, they say practice, practice, practice. Practicing something with your prefrontal cortex online will not always work if you're having that desperate one part after the other stir up. It just will not. And so some of the things that can help people in their interpersonal relationships is, one, helping them notice the difference between what is a trigger, what they're bringing to the relationship, like what they're projecting onto the other person, and encourage them to be curious about what the other person might actually be experiencing. And so, you have to do a lot of validation. As I understand, to you, it really felt like this person didn't care and yada, yada. And in the first part of therapy, you're just doing that. But then you kind of pull in, well, I wonder why they would say that. Like engendering curiosity about why the other person would do that and why they might have said that. And say, and they're like, yeah, but it's not okay they said that. And so I'm not saying it's okay. And I'll say, I'm just trying to figure out what happened between you and this person, unless of course this is like, a sadistic person or, just a person they need to get away from, of course. Another thing that will help interpersonally is helping them see these traumatized parts that you're working with as responses to early attachment trauma instead of who I really am, because they get stuck in relationships because they have these strong responses. They've been told their whole life that means that they're crazy, needy, whatever. And so at times they really use the fight and buckle down and like, I thought you loved me and this is how I am. Meanwhile, they're saying things that would make anyone feel unsafe, right? But they're accusing, so just getting under just overall throughout the treatment, this isn't who you are. Who you are is, and then help them find aspects of things that are actually who they are. You're someone who loves it outside. You're someone who believes in fairness, okay. And then this last one is kind of an advanced thing, but it does help. If you could eventually help that client understand the negative responses they get from other people as separate from how those people feel about them overall. And I'll say, like, look, you hate feeling this way, and you have all these feelings that are very difficult. Well, what's happening in that moment is that other person doesn't know what to do with those feelings either. You actually have both you and them are kind of in the same boat, not knowing what to do about these big feelings. And so sometimes when people are threatened, they do. And then you explain to them that the other person is going to have a threat response to what they're doing. And that's about them not feeling safe, not with the client, not with them as a human and who they really are. But in those moments, the client is getting triggered and is reliving their trauma. And why the person is responding badly is that they don't know how to deal with that trauma any more than the other person, than you do. But they still want a relationship with you. They just don't know what to do with your trauma response. That it takes a while, but that one can really help the relationships a lot. And I've done that a lot with people. Yeah, and so I guess it builds on this one, help the client develop their identity as an adult separate from their attachment trauma. So help them see that they are not their traumatized parts, help them identify things that are genuinely interesting, life-giving, and inspiring to them, nurture their natural interests, encourage them as they step forward to develop their strengths. And, you know, like I was just saying before I got the slides back up, you know, each one of these movements forward will be accompanied by pushback internally. And so you're doing these things in terms of encouraging this stuff, but you're also realizing that it's not going to feel safe because all these things involve being able to be a person rather than being who someone else needs them to be. And then the other thing, I did a presentation a couple of months ago about the SSP, which is one music listening therapy to help the vagus nerve. But anything that helps the vagus nerve will help it will help people with BPD. So the therapy to process the connection with you, any positive connections with other people, connecting with pets or other animals, connecting with nature. There's yoga moves that target the vagus nerve, positive spirituality, listening to music, viewing art, reading fiction, creating music and art, singing and humming, meditating and praying. And so early on in treatment, you're looking for which of these things is the least, feels the most safe to them. And depending on the person, any of these things can be seen as safe or unsafe, which is separate from, does the person need whatever the thing is? It's what it, you know, and so one thing, like a practical thing I do in the beginning with clients like that, this for the vagus nerve, is practicing being mindful of moments that you felt at least okay a little bit. And often they're connected with these things because it's the vagus nerve that's responsible for everything that makes us feel good, right? And so you're encouraging them to think about those things. And then one thing that can be accompanied by that to strengthen the positive feelings is if you've done EMDR training, they talk about the butterfly hug like this. And if you've done EFT training with the tapping, like doing a tapping motion while thinking about whatever that moment was that made you feel good, that can be calming to the person too. So I guess that's another response to the early on stuff is you're looking for whatever activity or whatever feels somewhat safe enough and generates any positive feeling whatsoever. And you're helping to feed that. And there might be parts that don't want them to do those things too, but that's also part of it. And then the other thing is it's really about us. It is in terms of whether this is going to be effective. And so being able to be so as a clinician, mindful, compassionate self-awareness is essential. And so along those lines, you know, identify and take care of any of your own parts, which may not be as separated as some of your clients, but they may be. So any of your own parts that feel a desire to fight, typos, I'm just putting this thing together, fight, freeze, fawn, flight, or, you know, rescue is another common one when you connect with people with BPD. Be aware of any tendency in yourself to prefer some of your own parts to others. Be aware of your own responses to criticism, suspicion, dependency, which request for reassurance goes under dependency, because these clients will pull one or more of those from you. And whether you're able to regulate when somebody directs that negativity toward you is going to affect how effective you're going to be. And so also be mindful of your own tendency to either dissociate, push aside, or get, overstimulated in response to intense emotions. Because people with BPD feel their anger, their desperation, and their anxiety very intensely. And so, and they need you to be present without either shutting down or freaking out yourself. And so knowing how do you respond when people have these strong emotions. Oh, also helplessness, they can feel very strongly. That's also or hopelessness, being in the room with that is tricky. So instead of getting hooked into the feeling with them, being present, and then helping them name what is happening. Because how we learn to regulate our emotions in the context of attachment is, we talked at the beginning about attunement of noticing, responding, and then adjusting as needed. Well, we're teaching people how to do that to themselves, how to notice something is amiss and name what that thing is and try to respond in a way that helps. And just as you would with an infant, if it doesn't help, if whatever you're doing, making yourself feel worse, to adjust, right? And so that's what you're teaching them to do. But in order to do that, you need to be able to be present and say like, oh, it seems like you're really feeling this thing, or wow, it seems like when we talked about this, then you started feeling this thing, or, helping them understand, because narrative is extremely important. And because those primary like attachment trauma flashback stuff, there is no narrative. There isn't. There's just terror and emptiness and blackness and, rage without container that like spreads to everything. And so like when you are helping and naming that you may feel attachment trauma, everyone's attachment trauma feels different, but ask them early on in treatment, well, what does alone feel like? Because the specifics of it will depend on what happened to them. And name like, okay, that's a flashback. Pre-verbal flashbacks aren't often recognized as such. And so being able to help them understand like, okay, so that whatever names they have for that feeling that comes up came up. And then this part did this and this part did that. But in order to do that, you got to be present, not checked out. And you got to not get hooked into the individual parts and try to fix them.